Hi, everyone. We'll get started in a couple of minutes at the top of the hour. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in about 1 minute right at the top of the hour. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and welcome to our today's webinar on data tools for walking, biking, and safe routes to school decision making. My name is Michelle Lieberman. I'm the Senior Technical Assistance Manager here at the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. I'll be your moderator today. We're going to cover some new tools and strategies that agencies and communities are using to take data and make decisions and around support for walking, biking, and safe routes to school. It seems like we have a whole wealth of data sources and tools, and they're always changing and always growing. So we're really excited to bring this webinar to you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I want to start first with a little bit about the Safe Routes to School National Partnership, if you're not familiar with us. We're a national nonprofit organization working to advance safe walking and biking to and from schools and communities. We're working to improve the health and well-being of kids of all races, income levels, and abilities, and fostering the creation of healthy communities for everyone. A little bit about what we do more specifically. We're working to improve the quality of life for kids, families, and communities. We advance policy change at the federal, state, regional, and local levels. And we catalyze support for safe, healthy, and active communities. And we share our expertise as we learn from the field. I want to give you a little bit of housekeeping on the GoToWebinar system. On the left is the GoToWebinar viewer, where you'll see the presentation. And the right is the control panel, where you can raise your hand, ask questions, and select the audio mode you use. Please note that your control panel will collapse automatically when it's not in use. To keep it open, you can click the View menu and uncheck Auto Hide Control Panel. We have two options for listening to us today. You can either use your telephone or your computer mic and speakers. If you have sound problems with one of the selections, try the other. And if you're still running into any problems, we'll do our best to try to field any issues. To send us a message in the chat box. We're all muted today, but if we really do want to hear your input. If you would like to ask any questions, use the question box to ask speakers questions, and we'll have Q&A at the end of the webinar. Let's see. And then after viewing today's presentations, you might want to view it again or send the link to your friends and colleagues. You can do either of these by accessing our website at saferoutespartnership.org, clicking on the Resource tab heading, and clicking on the webinars in the list on the left side of the menu, or left page menu. All of our past webinars are stored here for your viewing pleasure, and they're great resources, so I really urge you to take a look at this page. And finally, before we get started, do a little plug for the Safe Routes to School conference. We hope that you'll join us in Tampa, Florida this November. Early bird registration opens on April 1st. And we've also opened nominations for the annual or the Hub Smith Safe Routes Championship Award. For information on any of this, visit saferoutesconference.org. All right, and now for our speakers. First, we're going to hear from Dave Cowan. For the past decade, Dave has worked in the field of walking and bicycling at the local, regional, state, and national levels. He has advanced safe routes to school projects, implemented programs, and took that experience on the road conducting trainings, webinars, and sharing best practices in both policy and program work. He currently serves as the Safe Routes to School Coordinator for the Minnesota Department of Transportation and is the proud father of 2 young cyclists. Dave is going to share with us a great database and mapping tool that MnDOT has developed to visualize safe routes to school activities. Take it away, Dave.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for having me today. Want to make sure you can hear me all right and see my screen?
You're good.
Excellent. My name is Dave Cowan. As Michelle mentioned, I work at the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and I'm housed in our Office of Transit and Active Transportation. I've had the good fortune of being able to work on walking, biking, and safe routes to school for some time now. But more importantly, in terms of experience, I get to walk, bike, scooter, skate with my kids every morning to school. It continues to be the most important meeting of my day, but also has really contributed to some of my background knowledge on what it really takes at the local level to implement safe routes to school projects and programs. That's everything from what can be difficult in terms of organizing walking school buses or bike trains, or trying to implement an event in an otherwise busy school schedule, as well as just working with volunteers and parents and trying to overcome the perceived barriers of high-speed traffic, dangerous crossings, or even child abduction. So we get to take some of that experience and apply it here at the state level, where we try to think about how do we use levers that we have up here at the state to help affect those community level folks that are trying to implement safe routes. One of the ways that we've done that, this is from a study that Jennifer Pelletier did in 2016, is really work to, serve as a leader at the state level, but utilize or leverage our relationships with regional development organizations and public health and nonprofits here in the middle to help us better reach schools and communities. The way that we do that, that's a little bit unique for Minnesota and worth mentioning before I talk about our data tool, is we have a really strong marriage between transportation and health here in the state. What you're looking at up on the screen is our regional development organizations who actively participate in safe routes to school planning and programs throughout the state, and are one of our key regional allies in helping support local programs. Additionally, on the right, you're seeing a map of our statewide health improvement program areas. We've received, I think back in fiscal year 16-17, $35 million to award grants to community health boards and tribal governments to advance issues related to healthy eating, active living, and tobacco cessation. And so we have coordinators working at each of these levels, as well as in the regional level, inside of the regional development organizations that have safe routes to school or active transportation on their list of things to do. So we have this vision in the state of Minnesota where all students can walk and bicycle on routes that are safe, comfortable, and convenient. We extrapolate upon that in a statewide strategic plan that we finalized back in 2015, and then we use all of those strategies to guide our daily work, both here at MnDOT and at the regional level. A quick rundown of what we're doing and what kind of data we were trying to pull together when we started thinking about this tool. We recognize that a comprehensive 6E strategy is critical, a data-driven strategy for successful shifts in mode at schools. So we've invested heavily since about 2012, but also before that, on planning assistance for communities to establish their safe routes team, mobilize around effective strategies. We now have over 400 schools in the state that have plans. And then they take those plans and they begin to implement a lot of the E's that we talk about pretty regularly in Safe Routes. We've got our participation in walk and bike to school day events, our winter walk to school day here in Minnesota. We have a pedestrian and bicycle safety education program that is called Walk Bike Fun, where we are training educators in a train-the-trainer model, where we've trained over 700 educators statewide. We have bike fleets that have been funded with MnDOT dollars as well as statewide health improvement program dollars to support those trainings. Of course, we've had Safe Routes to School infrastructure projects throughout the state. We have a resource center with crossing guard trainings, implementation grants, and so we've got all of this stuff, all of these programs and projects that are going on, and wanted to be able to answer the question when people came to us about what was happening with those. And really, 3 years ago or so, when I started at MnDOT, we were getting a series of questions that we wanted to be able to better answer. A legislator might ask, how are we utilizing Safe Routes to School funding in the state? Advocates might ask, where or how are we spending that money? What does demand for Safe Routes to School look like in Minnesota? Any number of individuals wanted to know if any Safe Routes to School planning had been done in their community and where they could find that plan. Frankly, that at times could be difficult to answer. And given that our approach was using the planning process as a cornerstone of our program, we needed to make these easier to access. We also had MnDOT project managers or city and county engineers that might want to easily find plans related to road projects where they were working. That statewide health improvement program had staff coming and going and understanding the history of Safe Routes to School in their area, what kind of activities were going on and how they might plug into that. Same for our regional development organizations. Those planners might be interested in what activity there has been in their region in the past. Or a district superintendent or a school principal or parent, just inquiring about what's been going on with Safe Routes at my school, maybe as they first arrived at the school and the original team had turned over. And I'd be remiss not to mention that we had some of this information in some formats and in some cases, missing information. And it could be really difficult to answer these questions. So we sat down and took a hard think about what we could do. And we put together this project and this tool that I'm getting ready to roll out to you here in a second. We had these number of audiences that we wanted this tool to be useful to. That's over on the right. Feel free to take a gander. But we wanted to focus on these goals. We wanted to represent just how much had been going on with Safe Routes. We wanted to make those plans for those 400 schools more accessible to anybody in the public. We wanted to demonstrate the local impact of our constructed projects and also be financially transparent with regard to the Safe Routes to School program. But we wanted mainly to have this all in one place so you could see what's been going on in Minnesota with Safe Routes to School. And, we kept that places, some of it, and we had that in spreadsheets in various offices. It was not necessarily in a single location. It might be sliced a couple of different ways. There might be one funding source versus another that was funding something around Safe Routes, infrastructure versus non-infrastructure. And so we took a little time to gather data both from internally in MnDOT, but also from our partners at MDH and through the SHIP program, the Minnesota Department of Health and the statewide health improvement program. But we didn't just want the data for data's sake. We wanted data that could tell a story because obviously something like this is useful to maybe one or two people that know how to operate a spreadsheet of this size. You're probably wondering if it's something you're thinking about for your state, what tools are needed. It was actually relatively simple and easy and uses fairly rudimentary tools that I believe most departments of transportation have some version of. That starts with Excel. We had much of this data in Excel. We did build upon it to have a more robust reporting within the tool that we created. And we use ArcGIS. If you're not familiar with it, it's a platform for organizations to create, manage, share, and analyze spatial data, which is a really long way of saying it's a map of all the stuff that's over in that Excel spreadsheet. But most importantly, we needed a little bit of time and some expertise. This project was always on our one-day list, something that we wanted to do, but we were so busy, implementing the projects and running solicitations and overseeing the Safe House to School program that this kept getting pushed to the back. And we brought on an intern last year that helped us organize all this data. I like to give Austin as much credit as I can because he put this all into one place and then built it out so that it was easy once we loaded it into ArcGIS. So this is it. It's currently on our website. I'm going to share the link with you at the end of this, but just for the sake of keeping it simple and hopefully not running into any issues with your computers, we kept it all on PowerPoint. So when we started to organize this, you'll remember I was talking about those audiences. One thing to note, if you haven't used ArcGIS before, is that there are a series of layers of data that you can add or subtract to a map to help you better understand whatever data you happen to be looking at. In this case, we created or borrowed really layers that already existed in ArcGIS or within the Minnesota Department of Transportation to add these audiences. So this is what you're looking at here is really useful to Safe Route staff here at MnDOT, but also project managers and planners looking at MnDOT construction districts. We also, I mentioned this earlier, we have the Statewide Health Improvement Program grantees, another audience and another way of looking at the data that we'll overlay here shortly. But also schools, right? Where are all the schools in Minnesota and what are they up to? School districts. This could be back to the superintendents wondering what might be happening within their district, to a SHIP coordinator. Senate and House districts were another layer that we were able to easily capture. Those regional development organizations that were working on Safe Routes to School planning in Minnesota. Tribal nations. So those are a couple of the various views that you could take at this Visualizing Safe Routes tool. But for the sake of an example, I thought we would start with a Statewide Health Improvement Program grantees. I painted the picture of them earlier, but this is oftentimes someone working on public health, and they are working in a specific area, and we were seeing them coming and going, and wanted to figure out a way to provide some consistency for both their level and at the regional planners that we were discussing earlier. Of note, up here in this right-hand corner, if you haven't used ArcGIS before, you can pull this legend up at any point in time, and any layer that you have selected will show up and kind of tell you what that is. So we know that the pink lines are the SHIP grantees. And these are those layers that I talked about, the data that we imported from our Excel spreadsheet. We took schools that had participated in walk and bike events, people that had completed the Walk Bike Fun training and were prepared to teach pedestrian and bicycle education, where we had hosted those trainings, a slew of other MnDOT funded projects, including our plans, infrastructure, implementation grants, bike fleets, but also things that had been funded through organizations that were not MnDOT that we were aware of and had reported those to us. So we were able to provide all of these layers, and really by selecting any one of them, you can populate the map with projects that are happening in Minnesota. For fun, I did that just so you could see what it might look like if we were to talk about Safe Routes to School on a map. Obviously, it's not particularly useful looking at it like this. And then I moved the layer list over to the left so you could see it, but it really does pop up over on the right. Two more features before I dive into the data, and that's just that this is entirely searchable the same way an Excel spreadsheet would be. So you can search for, using this box up here, you could search for a city or a school location, and I believe a district, even though it's not popping up on there right now, or a school district. And you can also change the base map. You can look at this in far more detail, but for the sake of simplicity, we keep the base map that we have here currently. So let's go back to this example. I thought kind of driving through it would be the best way to show how this might be useful. Let's say you're in the role of a statewide health improvement program grantee, and for this example, we're down in Blue Earth County, which is down here in the southern side of Minnesota. You can select that county and it'll zoom you in here. You can find out some pretty basic details about what's going on actually in this area, but it's mostly geographic boundaries. And you will find that these data boxes pop up with every additional piece of the program that we click on. So if I'm new to the statewide health improvement program, I want to know what's going on. I go down to Blue Earth County. I select school districts because I want to have an idea with how many different safe routes to school teams I might need to be interacting with. Then I can go over to the layer list, and I can add which projects have been funded, at least through the Department of Transportation and SHIP, in this area, and it will begin to populate those on the map within those districts that we've already selected. And this is where it gets interesting. If you select the school district here, you're going to find that it's going to capture all of the projects that fall within those boundaries. So you see this 1 of 21. If you click here through on this arrow, you can start to see all of the projects that fall within this light blue boundary around the school district, and see kind of the history of safe routes to school in this district. And a reminder that as it starts to get more complicated, you can always kick back over to your legend and pull that up to see precisely what kinds of projects are being represented on the map. In this case, you'll notice that there's a difference between a non-MnDOT funded bike fleet and a MnDOT funded bike fleet just by color. You'll notice that we have different iconography based on the type of project that has been funded there. But this gets really useful when you zoom down to the project level, because as you notice in the map of Minnesota, everything starts to kind of clog together, and it's hard to tell what's really going on. But as you get in down at the community level here, you start to see specifically which schools have received which kind of safe routes to school funding, or what kind of activity happens to be going on there. And again, having this legend available is really useful for identifying what those are. So back to the transparency of the program and making sure that people can understand what we've been doing with safe routes, where safe routes to school plans are. When you click on any one of these individual projects, any one of these icons, it will pull up all of the data minus some pieces that we didn't find relevant for the map that we had available regarding that project. So it'll give you the award year. It'll tell you the project type. It'll give you the address of the school, what school district it falls in. It'll tell you the total enrollment of students at the time of the award, also the free and reduced lunch percentage at the time of the award. And this is one of those things where I point back to Austin, digging up some of this data that we didn't necessarily have on hand. But here's what's really neat about this, which is, we had all these plans that were kind of scattered about, and what we were able to do with this is if you click on this school and you see that this green circle is planning assistance, you can scroll down in that same thing where it says plan here and click on more info, and what will pop up is that that school's safe routes to school plan. And once you get inside of this, if you're the statewide health improvement program staff, you can start to dive into who is a part of that safe routes to school team that help make those decisions. Who can I connect with to help advance active transportation at the school level? what kind of priorities did they have when they went through this plan? What did we learn from their parent surveys, their walk audits, and all of the other data collection that they do, as well as community engagement that they do as a part of the Safe Routes to School planning process? The other possibility here, and this comes up with SHIP often, is looking for opportunity to engage, right? So I mentioned being able to engage with existing teams that have been identified and figure out how to join or support those, or look to schools that have bike fleets, or have active participation in walk and bike to school day events, but maybe that's where they've stayed for the past 5 years and they could really use a bump to start implementing pedestrian and bicycle safety in their classroom. By populating this map and zooming in, you're able to see kind of where there's been a great deal of activity versus not much activity at all versus no activity whatsoever. And speaking of no activity whatsoever, you can add all of those that school layer that I mentioned earlier, and you'll notice all of these gray dots that pop up. These are schools that haven't done anything related to Safe Routes. They haven't even had a walk and bike to school day event. There's obviously no plan or infrastructure that's been done there. So this might be a chance to reach out to some of these gray dots and see if they might be interested and just haven't been exposed to the idea, or help address some of the concerns and barriers that they might have towards pursuing Safe Routes to School more actively. Another opportunity here, and I mentioned this on the front end, we've got project managers, city and county engineers that are pretty consistently working on roads around schools. This is a great and easy resource for them to access anytime they're working on a particular roadway. This one falls within a couple of blocks of a couple of major roads, so why not pull up their plan and see what information or data was gathered when they were going through the planning process. If you're a legislator or a constituent and you want to be talking about Safe Routes to School, zooming in on the House and Senate districts with the projects populated is a superb way to show them precisely what's been going on with Safe Routes to School in their area over the years. Or an RDO planner. They are usually looking for communities that are interested in doing planning assistance. As you can see here, there's plenty of opportunity. Maybe these are schools that have turned them down in the past, but perhaps the principal's changed, or maybe they haven't been approached. And so this is a great chance to look at which schools have not pursued Safe Routes at all. Or if they have a Safe Routes to School plan and no other real activity going on, maybe it's an opportunity to reconnect with that community and talk about the strategies outlined in their Safe Routes plan. So I'm going to wrap up with just a couple of quick unexpected uses and then pass it on to Sean here. We have these bike fleets that we try to keep in pretty much consistent, constant circulation around the state. Recently we were having one that we wanted to get more use. We were able to pull this map up, take a look at the purple items here, which are individuals that have been trained in walk, bike, fun. You can see the fleet is looming underneath this person right here to figure out how we can better rotate the fleet around some of these schools and districts nearby. Similarly, for walk, bike, fun trainings in the spring and the fall, we hold a series of trainings around the state. And this has ended up being a pretty remarkable decision-making tool for us as we see who's participating and where we already have a number of people trained in teaching this curriculum, and where we've been with previous training so that we can make sure that we're having some geographic balance as we look towards advancing walk, bike, fun in the state. And so these are all one more time, just to come back to it, these are all of the goals and the audiences that we hope that this data tool addresses. I will be happy to answer any questions you have, I believe, after Sean gets done talking with you.
Thank you, Dave. This is great. Yes, and we'll have questions after Sean speaks. So if you have any questions, please enter them in the question box. We should have time for Q&A at the end. So next, we're going to hear from Sean Coe. Sean is the Director of Special Projects at StreetLight Data. At StreetLight, he helps public agencies solve old transportation problems with new solutions. Sean's a transportation planner with 20 years of experience working on a variety of projects, including safe routes to school, bike share, active transportation plans, and public health projects. Before joining StreetLight Data, Sean served as the first general manager of Strava Metro, where he worked with government agencies all over the world to provide crowdsourced bicycle and pedestrian data. And before that, Sean was also a consultant for a planning and engineering firm and has also worked at 3 of the MPOs in California. Sean's going to show us some great tools that StreetLight has created to help take big data and make decisions about walking and biking. Here you go, Sean.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. As Michelle mentioned, I'm at StreetLight Data. We are a company that works with public agencies all across the U.S. Using big data to really help solve transportation problems. So how do we get our data? That's kind of the big question that we talk about a lot. We get our data primarily from 2 different sources, and that is mobile phone device data from location-based services that a user has to opt into. So if you're using like the weather app and it says, do you want to use your location for this app? You say yes, and there are commercial companies that sell that anonymous data to companies like us, which we use to derive where people are going throughout the day. The second piece is from GPS-enabled navigation apps, primarily used in commercial truck fleets and also used in vehicle navigation as well. So between the 2, we have about 23% of the total adult population in the U.S. and Canada, and then about 12% of the commercial truck trips. This is just showing how people are moving throughout the day in a area of San Bernardino on the freeway. The yellow lights are the dots that light up using cell phone and GPS-enabled navigation, and then how those are distributed throughout the day. So the freeway carries a lot of cars, so then those cars then get distributed. And you can see within a community where those trips are occurring and where they're going. So this data is great, except that it needs to be turned into something that is useful to planners and people making decisions. So what we do is take that the big data, that geospatial data, we put that onto a road network, also with parcel land use data and demographics, which we pull from the census. And then we use cloud computing and machine learning to determine where those trips are going, the attributes of those trips, how they're distributed spatially within a city, all into a web application that you can access through a web browser, and then turn that into the type of analysis that you would see if you're a planner or engineer in a city. The type of information that we can get is very comparable to how things are done in a city. However, there are some things that we are able to do that it would be extremely expensive or take a long time to analyze, such as origin, destination, of where people are going from one area that could be as small as a census tract to as big as a zip code to another zip code. And that can be done in minutes using the platform along with real world data from the present and then also retrospectively in the past. So our goal is to be as accurate and to replace and complement count and survey data whenever possible, but be available and within a few minutes from the web app without waiting for a consultant or a staff person to analyze that data and then come back in 6 months and say this is how things looked 6 months ago, or even further when we collected the data. So it's really to have as much real-time information that can help inform decisions. So one of the advantages of location-based data is that it can show where, when, and how people move throughout a city. This slide is showing 2 sets of data displayed on a map within the city of Fremont, California. So the I guess seafoam kind of green color is from navigation GPS locations, which are, as I mentioned, more that come from vehicle data, and then the location-based data is more personal type data. So by personal, I mean anonymous ways that you are moving throughout the city, whether by walk, bike, car, otherwise. And so that gives us the precision which we need to analyze the trip and traveler attributes in a way that still respects people's privacy. So one of the things that we do to determine how different modes are being used throughout the day is we look at the number of cell phone and GPS pings. So that's every time a device communicates with either through Wi-Fi or through the cellular network, that pings a certain number of times throughout the day. And then we look at sort of the characteristics of that ping and then the probability of which it is a certain type of trip. So we do that using sort of the speed profiles of vehicles that we know, along with speed profiles of someone walking or biking. The travel speeds are much lower when you're biking and when you're walking, and you do different things within the network, and you cross differently. You make your trip sort of break differently, meaning that you stop and start, like if you're at an intersection on a bike, or if you're walking, and then we train the data using available statewide and regional travel surveys that use GPS in the travel surveys, along with capital bike share data. And we did this under the firewall of the NREL labs, where we were able to train our data using those GPS surveys that were collected to say, okay, great, this matches up with what we'd expect for this type of behavior. We then looked at the National Household Travel Survey and the California Household Travel Survey to really understand, does this line up? Is this what we would expect as planners and decision makers based on those surveys? Our sample size was 86 times larger than the National Household Travel Survey. So those surveys really have a small percentage representing a large number of people, so that the survey is only about 6,000 people in California for the biggest state in the union by population. The other thing is that we noticed that our trip distances were shorter than the surveys, especially the National Household Travel Survey, about less than or a little bit over a mile shorter in distance. And this is again really for bike trips, but we think that just because the way we are picking up bike trips throughout the day, this seems consistent with what is reported in the errors of those surveys, meaning that people often don't think about their short trips if you're walking or biking. So if I were to hop on my bike, ride it 5 minutes to the train station and then take the train, maybe I would record on a survey that I took really the train into San Francisco and not think of that bike trip. So that undercount, both on the bike and ped side, is kind of a big piece of contention within the surveys, because when we look at mode share, it's really asking how you got to work last week. And so I think with having this data available really shows that there are more people walking and biking than we previously thought. The second piece of validation we did was comparing our data to permanent count locations. So when we first rolled out the bicycle data piece, we did that in conjunction with the State Department of Transportation here in California, Caltrans, and they wanted to know how does it compare to, what we expect that people are doing, or how's that data validated. And we looked at permanent count locations. We needed continuous permanent count locations, and there's very few cities or regions that have that in the U.S. But when we looked at that, we found that those counters picked up, so if they were counting 24 hours a day, we would record, up to 5% of what we show on our platform would be picked up on their counters. So those counters are distributed in San Francisco, so we show everyone at any given time in the city. So, while it may not seem like a lot, those counters are on sort of high activity bike locations, where we're looking at everyone at one time. Some of the things that you can do in the web app, as I mentioned earlier, is that it offers the ability to see where people are going at any given time. So you can look at really any sort of small geography. So I mentioned Census Tract. This one is for Census Tracts in the city of Oakland near Jack London Square. Where are our bike trips originating from, and then where are they going to? So you can see, how far people might bike to a particular location. So the red indicates that there are a lot of trips that are beginning and ending in Jack London Square, meaning that if you lived within that census tract, you would then be able to ride your bike somewhere within that census tract. So fairly short trip, but there are people coming from the northern part of town, riding in either for commute or some other trip purpose. There's a lot of restaurants and cool things to do in Jack London Square, so that would be expected. And so you get to see that from sort of a larger view of the city rather than just putting counters out at a particular location and really get a glimpse of how everyone is moving. There is an exception to that, and particularly important to this group is privacy is extremely important to us. And so we don't have any data for children. And so, as I mentioned, we have 23% of the total adult population, but we don't have any for children, and that's because of privacy for that we need a respect for children. So if you have a child, under 13 years old, there is a setting you can call your carrier and say, this is a child's phone. My kids are too young to have that; they don't have phones, but you can then disable the location-based app for that. So we don't wait for the carriers to do that. We just decide we're not going to have that data in the platform, and as a result, the school locations don't have enough data in order to respect privacy. So as I mentioned, you can draw a particular zone in a city, except that you wouldn't be able to draw an activity at a school. And it wouldn't give you enough data. It would warn you and say there's not sufficient data in order to use it. So that's one caveat in particular for this group. However, there is still a lot that you can use from the application itself. We took a look at a location. This is in Berkeley, and my kids go to school straight up the street, but what type of trips are people taking, and then where are those locations and crossings needed? So while I would generally say that the city of Berkeley is pretty easy to walk in, there are a couple of locations that could use improvements. In particular, there's a path that crosses the street, and then you have to walk on the street and then get back onto the multi-use separated path. So I can then look and say, okay, how many people are going in the southbound direction during school hours, and how many are going in the northbound direction. And while they may not be going to the school necessarily, I know from the school surveys that a lot of people are walking this way to get to the elementary school. And same thing for along the street Hopkins. There's a number of crossings that are uncontrolled, so they're not striped. This is an important piece for kids that are crossing the street. So I could then pull the data and say, okay, to the city, there are actually more people walking here than the vehicles traveling down Hopkins. So you could do something like a bulb out, striping, other improvements to help facilitate that safe passage for kids going to school. The second piece that is interesting, I think, is the speed analysis. So as you're well aware, speed has a big effect on people's perceived safety and actual safety in crossings for schools. So I looked at an example in Vista, California, along a road, pulled data out for between the school hours where people commute, so 7 to 9 a.m. in the morning, and looked to see what the speeds were along this road, South Mesa Drive, which is in front of a school. Luckily, about 30% are going 20 to 30 miles an hour, but this is a big road and cars are going pretty fast. So almost 32% are going 30 to 40 miles an hour. I can further break this out to see, 35 to 40, but then nearly 15% are going 40 to 50 miles an hour, which is extremely high speed for a school crossing zone. And then the last piece that I'll touch on is the collision data. So as we know, we have a lot of collision data, and here in California, we have that mapped out by location. So this is for the city of Santa Ana in California, mapping out high injury, high crash locations, and showing both pedestrian and bicycle corridors. But oftentimes we don't have a metric to say, okay, this is terrible, but is it a lot? Like, what's the rate of collisions happening? Because we don't know how many people are walking and biking at a particular location. So what we did was then looked at the high pedestrian activity areas and showed, these are where people are going, which is reflected in that collision map. But then on the west side of town, there is a corridor that has a number of high pedestrian collisions, but actually relative to the other areas doesn't have that much pedestrian activity. So something's going on. Maybe there's some street improvements that could be made. It seems that people are overrepresented in those crash statistics. So those are some of the uses that we have seen people use the platform for, and I think it's just very exciting that we have the ability to help people make informed decisions through data. It helps either planners or engineers make decisions on how to put in infrastructure improvements that will help with schools. So that's all I had. I'd be happy to take questions.
Great, thank you, Sean. So if you have questions, feel free to keep entering them into the question box, and we've got some time to answer some of them. Let me share my screen. Have a few questions actually for Dave, and I think maybe sharing the link to the website would be good at this time to answer some of them. How much of the MnDOT tool is available online, and was it done online versus the desktop platform? So if you want to, I think Molly's going to go ahead and share the link right there.
Yeah.
Dave, if you have anything to say.
Well, the answer is down there in the chat box, which is we do have this published online right now. It's in a temporary spot right now. We'll probably move it to a different page on the site, but it is all of the data related to those projects, and it is all both embedded in that map, but you can also click on something to just see the spreadsheet if you're wanting to dig.
Awesome. Related question, you mentioned your awesome intern. For other agencies who want to do this, are thinking of taking this on, would you give them an idea of how long it took, how many hours, if you have an idea for that, and would you recommend thinking about using just internal resources or really having to consider going to a consultant or outside resources?
Yeah, I would say a good portion of the time that we spent, first of all, I'm not going to give a specific answer because it's so situational, but I will say that we spent a great deal of time doing some decision making about how the data was collected and sorted and represented versus if you were to take this, template and wanted to use it. We have an internal document that we created that helps us walk through how to populate all the data and then add it to the website that could also be shared if people want to follow up with me via email, which I'm realizing is not up on the screen right now, but I can shoot out in the chat box.
Great, thank you. Question for Sean. Have you seen applications using, or has StreetLight done applications of this tool in rural populations, looking at small communities like under 50,000?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, we have. It depends on what the analysis is for. So as I mentioned, we roughly have say that we need about 15 individuals represented in order to sort of pull any of those metrics that I talked about. So you can't identify someone. So if you live in 50,000 is actually, we have actually quite a bit of data for, but if you lived in a very, very small population and you were trying to see how many people were on a road and there was 4 houses, it would be hard to get data out of that. But yeah, we work with all communities, large and small, because there's a lot of people in the U.S. that have phones and a lot of GPS in vehicles.
Great, thank you. And actually, Molly, if you could push out Sean's email address as well, I've got some people who want to contact him directly too. Another question for you, Sean. Could you talk again about how the data compared to the results of the permanent bike counter data?
Yeah. What that meant was that if the San Francisco counters had 100 trips in a day, they would show 5 of what we would show in our data. So if it was 5%, so that doesn't mean that that's the absolute number necessarily, because even counters have quite a bit of error. When installing counters, there are a lot of guidelines on where to put them, on have calibration factors, site-specific adjustment factors for that data. And we also found a lot of errors in the data, like wild swings between, a certain day and the next, like, 100 times more, 1,000 times more people crossing. But I think what was important was that it correlated really well to the activity throughout the day. So, sort of what you'd expect. In the morning, there's a lot of people riding on particular corridors, and then, it drops off a little bit by mid-morning, picks up around noon, and then, picks up again in the PM.
Got it. Great. Let's see. Dave, another question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Is the mapping also tied to existing infrastructure? In particular, is there ability to look at trail network connections in conjunction with safe routes to school?
Well, I think that's related to the base. I was pointing out the base layers a little bit, that you could alter those. So if you're looking for the most recent visual of the actual infrastructure in place, I think you can activate that base layer and then zoom down to see what's in place there. But we didn't, outside of that base layer, we didn't add any additional data yet that represents that.
Great. Great segue into the next question. Any additional data you're considering adding or would really like to add?
As we've talked to people about this, there's been lots of great ideas that venture out more into other active transportation efforts, and I think they're suitable. What we ran into with this project, and back to that time that the intern took, is we spent a lot of time debating how much information was too much information to repel people from wanting to use the tool. And I think that'll be a consistent conversation moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Have to have a balance there. Okay. A couple more questions for Sean. In terms of the school locations, can you kind of give us a estimate or a size of the zone around schools where there isn't the data available?
Yeah, it's a little harder because it just depends on how many cell phone pings are around the area. I did one in front of where my kids go to school, and it did let me create. I wanted to see how fast cars are going in front of the school, because there was a bunch of curb cut improvements that went through that I think could be improved by making those curb cuts bulb outs, and it let me do it on the major street, but not on the minor street that was in front of the school. So this is directly in front. The school takes up, it's pretty big. It takes up, like a block. The minor street carries very, very few cars, but the major street does, and so it let me do that. So it's just highly dependent on the area.
Great. All right. Let's see. Sorting through the questions here. Got a lot of good questions coming in. Sean, I'm not sure if you're going to have an answer for this, but I'll give you the question. So we know that some folks are probably not tracked. They don't have cell phones, or they're not pulled into the data. I guess have you found that this impacts the data that you're looking at, or how would you sort of consider this group of individuals who are not usually trackable?
Yeah, great question. So we did look at that primarily for equity concerns, and I think just overall, what we found was that a lot of people have smartphones. So even low-income households who actually have higher rates of use than other households, because the smartphone may be their only computing device in the household. So rather than having computers, paying for internet access, you may just have a smartphone in that household. When compared to trying to look at biases in the data, it really actually wasn't statistically significant. However, the biases that are there are sort of two groups of people that I mentioned. One is for very young, so children, and then the second is for elderly people that may have smartphones but may not use location-based services as much as people, other people that have those enabled. So that is one thing that we're aware of, and we have tried to correct for in the data, and then related to, there is another bias sort of with commercial truck and GPS location-based systems, because those are from fleet vehicles and then sort of higher end luxury cars. But in the platform, we allow you to pick either GPS or location-based services, like personal data or sort of GPS for fleets, depending on what you want to analyze and what works for your situation.
Great. Somewhat related to that, for the non-GPS data, is the data being accessed continuously or only while people are using apps?
Yeah, so it depends on how that's set up. So if you have a phone and you turn on the weather, for example, you have to close that out So that's a setting, like at least on my phone that I have, that it says, using location while using app. So it will, some apps have that, which they are tracking in the background, and some do not. So the one that I use does say while using app. So if you just click off of that and it's still running, it will continuously provide that information, but you do have to close it completely. So like at least on an iPhone, you would double click the home button and then it displays all the apps like in a page format, and then you have to swipe up to close it. And then once it's closed, it's not tracking location anymore. But our sample size is big enough, and we have several suppliers that we are able to get enough data to show meaningful results.
Got it. All right. One last thing, Sean, if a jurisdiction wants to access StreetLight, should they send you a direct email? I'm guessing that's probably the case.
Yep, please do. Yeah.
Okay. And we've pushed out both of your emails. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We've almost to the top of the hour. So I want to thank both of our speakers and everyone for joining us. If you're looking for more information on things related to safe routes to school or active transportation, I would really encourage you to visit our website, saferoutespartnership.org. We also have information about our training, consulting services as well there. And finally, thank you again for attending the webinar. We'll be sending out an email with a link to the recording as well as a quick survey, and we'd really appreciate you taking the survey and providing us feedback so we can improve our webinars in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Michelle.
All right, thanks.